blustery day out here today. Lots of clouds, very dark clouds. Look like rain, but we haven't got any rain yet, which is good. But it definitely looks like it's going to start soon. Once we leave the safe confines of our dock slip here at the marina, we're basically going to be docked very, very rarely. The way we're actually going to spend most of our time at night is going to be at anchor. And so we have upgraded all of our ground tackle, as it's called, at the very front end of the boat. So we bought the new windlass that we have here, which is an electric motor that actually pulls and lowers the anchor, pulls it up and lowers it. I've got controls for that at the very back so that whenever I'm there at the helm and operating, because I want to move forward as I pull the anchor in, I can control it on the way in. So we got that brand new. We have a brand new, huge 44-pound anchor, and by comparison, our previous anchors were both 35 pounds, so we got 9 pounds heavier. So, what does that come out to? Almost 33% bigger anchor. And then we also have new chain for that new anchor. Chain gets old. It's just galvanized steel, which can break down in the saltwater environment. So as it gets older, you want to make sure that you replace it or inspect it. And if it looks rusty and like it's kind of shot, which our old chain that we actually removed, because we had two previously, and we pulled one of them out, and that one looked like it had been through the ringer. So we got rid of it. It was also only like 25 foot of chain, and we want to make sure that we have a good bit of chain, which I'll explain why in a little bit. We want to make sure that most of what we're putting out is chain because of the fact that that's nice and heavy, and it's also nice and strong, and it doesn't chafe on the rocks underground, and so that way we know that we're feeling secure. So we got brand new chain. So we've got our new anchor. We have 200 foot of chain, and then we have about 100 foot of rope, which is the new stuff. That combined with our old 2 anchors, which we had 2 of them previously, and the old chain that we did keep, which was about 125 foot of chain and about 150 foot of rope. All of that's like 500 pounds worth of ground tackle up here at the front of the boat. So whenever we pulled on the new chain, I've got like a new waterline that I had painted that's supposed to be where the boat sits in the water, and that new waterline's underwater at the front. So we're leaning forward. We're also leaning to the starboard. We're just all goofed up here on the boat, but that's okay. We're actually going to end up taking one of the anchors and moving it back into the underneath the aft berth, and I'm probably going to take the second chain too and move it back there because we really aren't going to need it on a regular basis. It's good to have as a backup, but we're not necessarily going to need it. So I do want to kind of go through what we have up here though. So we actually have underneath where our windlass is a nice anchor locker that's split into 2. So we can actually have 2 different separate chains in that anchor locker. And this windlass, as it's pulling it up, drops it right into that anchor locker, into the storage bins, and then as we lower it out, it pulls it out of there and then lowers it in. So I was a little bit nervous about whether or not I was even going to be able to fit a windlass up here, and Kelly can tell you it was a long process to try to get this thing oriented correctly, make sure that I knew how I was going to do it, because we actually have these 2. We had 2 of them before, chain pipes as they're called, and it's where the actual old chain would go. I was the windlass before. I was the one who had to pull it up, so whenever we were leaving anchor, I had to just hand over hand pull the anchor up, and then once we got to where it was just the anchor that was buried in the ground, I actually had to tie it off, and then we had to break it loose because it was a little heavy for me. But we didn't really want that because of the fact that if we're in stormy conditions where we really got to get the anchor up and get out of dodge, I don't really want to be up here at the front of the boat while we're bouncing around and everything's crazy and chaotic, and me trying to pull it up while we're trying to see if I can even pull the boat forward to pull it up, which I don't think would even work. So we upgraded to this nice new anchor windlass, which is going to do the job of pulling it up. It's oversized for our boat, which means that we're never going to really run into issues of can it actually pull up the anchor the way it needs to. So this is a huge, huge upgrade, which is going to make my life much, much easier. And then the new anchor that we got is supposed to be pretty fantastic. So anchors, because I know I said it was a 44-pound anchor, and anchors aren't really, the weight matters, but the weight matters mostly because of the strength that comes along with the weight. So you want to make sure that the anchor actually digs into the ground, and so you want it to be a little heavy for that. But in reality, it's not the weight of the anchor that's actually holding you in place. This new one is almost like a flat shovel, and it has the shank coming up out of that flat shovel. And what it basically does is, as we pull back on the anchor chain to dig it in, which we'll lay out all the chain, and then we back the boat up to drag that chain along the ground, which then is going to dig the anchor into the ground. That flat kind of shovel plate basically angles itself into the ground and then just buries. So the further back we pull it, the further down it buries, and the more soil or sand or whatever else is down there that we've got on top of that anchor, that's what's going to keep us from pulling it out if the wind gets really heavy. And that's absolutely critical. So this new one is a pretty fancy one, because the old one we had before was almost like a plow that you'd see on a farm. It was basically just kind of a triangular plow shape that would just dig down in, and it works okay except for in like really muddy, soft, muddy conditions where it just kind of cuts right through it. This new one is actually made that once it gets buried underneath there, it's not really going to keep sliding further and further. It's made to just kind of sit in place once you bury it in there. So the new one's going to be much better, and we did upsize it because of the fact that, you know, there's always the possibility we might be anchored out in 50 or 60 knot winds, which is a lot of wind. Never know what's actually going to come through, and we want to make sure that this new anchor is, first of all, new, no rust on it, and that it's heavy enough and strong enough to really hold in place. And that takes us on to our new anchor chain. So I said that we actually want a lot of anchor chain, and the reason for that is because if you were to imagine, here's the seabed, here's the surface of the water, our boat's up here at the surface of the water, our anchor's out here in the seabed. If we have all anchor chain, we have this nice heavy weight of chain that's connecting us down to the anchor, and what that means is that we've got this nice curve, because the weight of the chain is going to kind of create this curve and pull down towards the actual seabed. And so as the wind blows and gets really heavy, we've got this sort of shock absorber that has to get pulled straight. All that weight of the chain has to get pulled straight, which means that if we get a big gust of wind, it acts as a shock absorber as we drift back, so that not a whole lot of force just gets directly put onto the actual cleats and everything else up here. So having that nice heavy chain makes a big difference. The other shock absorber that we have is, it's behind me, this black line here. And this is called a snubber, and it's a 3-strand nylon rope, and it's got a hook that we can actually attach to the chain. And that snubber is actually what ties the anchor chain off to the boat. So we'll put the hook onto the chain and let out about 15 or 20 foot of that line, and then we'll tie that off to the cleat. And what that does is also acts as another shock absorber. So we have that curve of the chain that has to get pulled straight. That's our first one. The other one is this, because chain doesn't stretch. Once it gets pulled straight, you're going to feel every bit of force directly into the cleat of the boat or into the windlass. You don't want that, so we put the snubber on there so that it can stretch and give some shock absorption and not damage any of our equipment here. Also not damage the anchor, because that is always a possibility with older anchors, not really with the brand new one, where if it gets pulled to its max, it's just going to snap, and you're just going to then be drifting on out to sea, or even worse, drifting right into the rocks and shore, which is usually what ends up happening if somebody drags. Very rarely are they dragging out to sea. Usually it's because the wind shifted and they're dragging into shore. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And that's why, oh boy, the rain's coming. Let's go downstairs. Now we're in the safety of the downstairs. And the messy desk and everything.
And the bad lighting.
And bad lighting, yeah, it is bad lighting down here. But that's life, that's all right. But, so, that's our fancy new ground tackle. And there's a few things that I was gonna just sort of sketch out so that we give an idea. Do a little bit of teaching and everything like that. So let's do a little bit of sketching for visualization purposes of what I was saying. So this right here is our seabed. This is our water. We got waves, all that good stuff. We've got ourselves a little boat that's right here. It's got itself a mast and a boom and some sails and all that good stuff. And then down here in the seabed is where our anchor is. So we'll say that's what our anchor is. So we'll have chain that's actually going to connect us down to that anchor. And as I was saying, the reason that you want all this to be chain is because the weight of this chain is going to pull down towards the seabed, and that's going to pull the boat forward, forward, forward until you have sort of an equilibrium of the wind blowing up against the boat, which is then pulling the chain enough off the ground to where it sort of counteracts. There'll be enough weight that's pulling the boat forward to counteract however much wind is there. So you'll have a lot of chain that's laying on the seabed, and then it'll actually come up and curve towards the boat. And what that means is that if this wind were to gust up and we get a really, really strong wind, then the boat's just going to drift back. And as it drifts back, then that chain's going to get pulled up straighter and straighter and straighter, and it will eventually reach a point where it's going to get pulled perfectly straight, and that's as far back as the boat's going to go. Usually what happens there is you'll feel just a little bit of a jolt, and then we'll start drifting forward a little bit, and usually the wind's not as gusty then, and then it gusts again, and you'll just kind of bounce back and forth, but that gives you that shock absorption. And the other thing that is important about anchoring is making sure that you have the right amount of scope out. And that's what we call it. And it's a pretty simple thing. It's just however deep it is, you want to make sure that you have a certain ratio of chain let out based on that depth. And the sort of commonly held standard of what people go with is anywhere from 5 to 7 to 1. So you want either 5 to 1 or 7 to 1, somewhere in that range. That's pretty good for just a general all-around, you're planning to be safe at night type anchoring. If you got a really bad storm coming, you might step up to 10 to 1. And what that means is for every foot of depth, you want 5, if we were doing 5 to 1, 5 foot of anchor chain out. So let's say that it was a 10 foot of depth that we're sitting in, and actually you also want to add in whatever the height of your boat is above the water, because that adds into that height. But let's say that it's 10 foot from the bottom up to where the anchor chain connects to the boat. If that's 10 foot, then you're actually going to want out 50 foot of chain. If you were wanting to be safe, you would let out 100 feet. If you stepped up into 15 foot, then I'm starting to get into math that I can't do in my head that quickly, so let's do 20 foot. If it was 20 foot for a 7 to 1, then you've got 140 foot of chain that's out. So that's just a good rule of thumb of how much chain you want to let out. And what that does is it actually gives you that correct angle, because you don't actually want to have it so short that your chain is pulling directly up on the anchor, because if the wind does blow pretty hard, that anchor can actually get popped up out of the ground and can get pulled up. So if you have the right amount of scope out, then you're going to have the proper angle that these anchors are made and are designed to be set in the ground for. So if you have the right amount of scope out, then it's not actually going to pop it up out of the ground. You're going to stay secure at night. You're going to have a good night's rest. You might have to watch other people dragging and screaming and everything else, but put some earplugs in and you can sleep just fine. It won't be a big deal as long as you're doing your stuff right. Actually, no, that's not true. If we do see other people dragging, I can guarantee you we'll be there trying to help out and make sure that they're safe, because it's a close-knit community and you got to make sure you take care of each other, because you never know when your time's coming. We used to whitewater kayak, and what we would always say is that you're always between swims. So make sure that you're helping somebody out, because it's guaranteed you're going to have your swim coming up at some point. And that means swimming out of your kayak in a river. So you always want to make sure that you're helping other people out, because of the fact that your time's going to come and you want to make sure you got somebody to rely on at that point. And that is our new ground tackle. Super excited about it. I'm ready to start using it. Oh, I almost forgot. In the beginning of the video, you probably saw that our chain is painted all kinds of fun colors. We've got red, yellow, blue, and orange, and that's actually to tell us every 25 feet of how much chain we've paid out. So I marked red as 25 and 125, yellow is 50 and 150, blue is 75 and 175, and orange is 100 and 200, and that way we know how much chain we've actually put out, so that we can make sure we got the right scope out and that we're going to be safe at night. As I said, I'm really, really excited to use it. We're going to be leaving soon, which means that we get to start using it on a very, very regular basis, and we're going to put it through its paces, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure to subscribe so that you can join us and come along for that journey as we go along and use it. Watch the rest of our videos. Go back if you haven't seen all the early ones, and then stick around for the journey as we keep on going out, because we're going to be out there sailing soon, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Talk to you soon.